Hi there, I'm Paul. I've spent the last decade building startups that put a dent in income inequality. Prior to my current startup, which I'll get into in a minute, I built a company called Alice, who builds pre-tax spending for people. And our mission was to raise the paychecks of blue-collar workers by $1 an hour by helping them get more money in their paycheck by paying for things pre-tax. More recently, I founded Daylight, which is a company that's aiming to close the LGBT wealth gap. And on this journey of building both of these businesses, I've had a chance to think about what it means to build inclusive technology. And I'm going to share with you some of my learnings. But first, let me give you a little bit of a palate cleanser before we dive into the hard stuff. Consider this map. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. I would hope some of you saw this on a classroom growing up. And for me, as a kid growing up in London, the UK was reassuringly in the middle. Now, if you grew up in the US, you might have seen something like this, or perhaps you grew up in Asia where you'd seen a map like this. Now, none of these maps are intrinsically bad, but what it starts to show us is that technology is centered around the people who create it, and it comes from a very specific viewpoint. The other thing about technology is it has certain trade-offs. So what you see when you see a map is a 2D representation of a 3D globe. And this particular projection, the Mercator projection, was actually designed for seafaring navigators. So latitude and longitude are presented parallel. Now, what's the trade-off here? Well, it's the relative size of countries. So if you actually look at a map that has projections where land masses are represented equally, what you see is something like this, where Greenland is a tiny fraction of the size of Africa, and Europe is correctly shown as half the size of South America. So why does this matter? Well, in the messy cauldron of geopolitics, it may be useful for us to think of seeing land masses for the size that they actually are, because like it or not, size matters, and we equate importance to size. So let's attempt a bit of a definition of what it means to build inclusive technology. It's not just about code, it's about the people and processes that come together to execute on an idea. So when I think about inclusive technology, I think of product, technology, and teams that maximize for human value. Bear in mind, this isn't at the expense of profit. That's absolutely a core value. I can talk to you about my theory of change, non-profits versus for-profits, but we'll save that for another day. Technology should know its weaknesses. As you'll see in this presentation, there's no perfect solution to this. And what's important is that we understand where our systems break down and how we address that. And lastly, we build systems that strive to create the world that we want, not just use data to replicate the systems and things we already have. So let's dive into some principles here. First off, respect identity. So when you cherish your customer's identity, when you treat them as humans, you demonstrate respect for the people who frankly put roofs over your head and pay your bills. Some tactical examples. Pronouns matter. When you misgender someone, you're showing ignorance and lack of respect for them. Names matter. It's a very core representation of identity. At Daylight, we're the first banking platform that's built on the brand promise of never dead naming any of our customers. That means not on your card, not in the application, not in anything you receive in the mail, or when you speak to customer success. Now, that's not just about me building code for my team, it's about working with my vendors to make sure that they also hold this principle true. Next, build systems to represent human values. Now, at first blush, this seems pretty straightforward, but the devil here is actually in the details. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to take you on a little sidetrack to talk to you about a story of some tardy llamas. So imagine a world in which I have a bunch of green llamas, and some of them are late some of the time. And what I would like to do is understand or build a predictor that's going to tell me who's likely to be a tardy llama. So as you can see, my predictor predicts these 3 llamas are going to be late, and it's doing reasonably well. It's right 2/3 of the time. Now, imagine I have a new audience of yellow llamas. Now, these guys are a little more tardy. There's 6 out of 10 of them are late. And I'm going to see how my predictor performs here. Again, 2/3 of the time it's getting it right. So far, so good. We have a model that equally predicts accuracy across these two audiences of llamas. But let's take a closer look. For the green llamas, 7 of them are on time, but 1 out of 7 I predict incorrectly to be late. And of the yellow llamas, 4 are on time, but 2 of them I incorrectly predict to be late. So that means that for these different audiences, there's a different false positive rate. Okay, so far so good. But what does that actually tell us? The point here is, what are you actually going to do with this information? Now, if I was going to provide taxis to the llamas I thought were going to be late for work, it might not seem so bad. But what if I offered different salaries to these people? Or what if I denied them a job? Or what if I denied them bail? So this cute story I'm telling you is actually grounded in reality. Excuse me. In 2018, ProPublica released research into a system called Compass that was produced by a company called Northcote, and it was used to predict the likelihood of someone who'd been arrested, the likelihood of them being rearrested. And what they found was that Black folk who subsequently didn't go on to get rearrested were 50% more likely to be denied bail than white folk. Now, despite the sort of depressing predictability of hearing something like that, what's interesting to me is that when this research came out, Northcote produced a very vigorous, I think it was a 37-page response, defending the quality of their model. And what they were doing was talking about the accuracy of their model, the llamas 2/3 of the time. And what ProPublica was highlighting is what happens when you get a false positive. So when you build a system or build a model, it's important that you think about all of your stakeholders of the system, not just the true positives, not the true negatives, but also people who are incorrectly labeled as false positive and false negative. Related to this, it might be tempting to say, okay, cool, let's just ignore protected attributes when we build our systems. But I want to share with you why this might not be the best idea. And for this, I'm going to use some research that was made by a team, excuse me, led by Maurice Hartz at Google. And in the research, they looked at 300,000 credit scores and marked anything as default an account that went over 90 days in arrears in the subsequent 2 years. And they modeled certain scenarios looking to maximize profit. Now, if FICO scores were truly colorblind, then a single threshold, regardless of race, would yield maximum profit. But what they actually found was that if you were to solely maximize profit and ignore any notion of fairness, you'd have to have a different threshold per race. And if you wanted to adopt a notion of fairness that said we're going to offer loans equally to different demographics, you'd have yet another range of scores provided to users. And lastly, they proposed a mechanism of fairness which is optimized for an equal proportion of good loans. For the sort of mathematicians in the room, this is basically optimizing for the same true positive rate across different groups. So when we use data to make forward-facing decisions, we have to think about recognizing that encoded in that data is all the history and biases of the world in which we used to inhabit. And we should think about how we use this information knowingly to build the systems and future that we want. Number 4, poke a hole in the black box. So when people think of decision makers, companies like us, big tech, big pharma, small startups, they often see us falling into one of two camps. One, that we're callous or malicious, and the law is the only thing holding us back from bad behavior. Or 2, that we're fundamentally good, and thinking about fairness helps us avoid unintentional consequences. Now, we all like to think of ourselves as falling into that latter category, but given polarized politics of today, it's inevitable that people often think we occupy that former space. And my provocation to you is, how might we think to reduce the number of people who think that we operate from that callous position? And the challenge here is that often we think of our algorithms on our systems as our special sauce. And if we open them up, more bad actors might game the system. But there is a solution here. There's programs like Equitas that can be used to audit your algorithms for unintentional bias. That way, you can maintain the black box nature of your algorithm or the secret source of your algorithm, but also you can check for unintentional bias. Number 5, take a walk in another neighborhood. So it's a really common refrain to get out of the building and go speak to your customers. But what I want to encourage you to do is go one step further and speak to people who are adjacent to where your customers might be, or even speak to people who you think of as your detractors. An example for us, Daylight is a 100% remote company. And for our offsites, we have been to cities and neighborhoods that are traditionally thought of not particularly safe spaces for the queer community. Our last one was in suburban Indianapolis. So that way we could learn about what it's like to be queer in a small town that's not so welcoming to the queer community. Number 6, exercise your power. So usually I present this conversation to a room full of engineers. And what I mean about this slide is really at the very individual level. So as engineers and product builders, we inhabit a time of immense privilege. Pretty much every engineer has the luxury of choosing what problem they want to solve in the world. And with that carries some measure of responsibility. For example, Google engineers didn't like that their AI tech was being considered for use in weapons technology. Or Microsoft employees believed their company shouldn't do work with the US Immigration Service as they were in violation of human rights law. In both those cases, they wrote an open letter to the CEO, and both companies changed their position. Now, they realize the level of power they have, but even at a more tangible and tactical level, if you don't think the place you're working champions what you believe in, there's many, many companies that do. By the way, hi, we're hiring. Love to bring on some more engineers. And last but not least, I just want to take a moment to recognize that this stuff can be hard. Recognize that what you're doing here in building technology and building inclusive technology in particular is a trolley problem when it comes to fairness. You're not going to please everyone. And unfortunately, those you don't please are going to be your loudest critics and your biggest detractors. But don't let that put you off from trying. Inaction isn't going to make the world any better. So there it is. Here's some of the principles I think of when I think of building inclusive technology. At Daylight, we think about these things to a lesser or greater extent every day, and they guide our work in closing the LGBTQ wealth gap. My invitation to you is to think about how you might make one small step to bring some of these into your work. Thank you.
Paul, thank you so much for such an amazing presentation. I've got a question from the audience, which we only have time for one, unfortunately. But you were talking about you were talking about poking a hole in the black box algorithms that the banks are using. Do you feel that anything has been done to combat this at the moment in the market?
Yes, there is. As I mentioned, a company called Equitas, I'll send you a link and I'm sure you can post it later. Equitas has done research into how you can measure systems for unintentional bias without necessarily exposing the inner workings of that. I think more generally, a push towards more transparency in how your systems work is generally a good thing. I'm sure many of us have had situations where we have been denied for a loan or something, and the bank's given us no understanding of why. That's actually very unhelpful. So generally, I would push towards more transparency there. But yes, there's work both tactically from companies like Equitas to do this, and there's also a bunch of academic research looking into how you might be able to measure the unfairness of a system, although that's actually a little controversial. So there.
Very, very tricky topic. Thank you so much, Paul, for your time and for your presentation. Appreciate it.
Sure thing.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.